for coming back for our second panel. Hope you had a chance to have a bite to eat and transition to the next part of our discussion. In the first panel, we talked about the effect of the new media on the issue of Palestine on the public discourse here in the United States. And so the second panel now will focus on whether or not this effect can translate into an effect on policy and not just the discourse. So before I introduce our panelists, who will start with their opening remarks here before we go into the discussion, I just wanted to point out that as we heard in the first panel, clearly we are starting to see an opening for different voices, a change in the discussion, and that this forum, or these different forums, have permitted people and voices who would never have been heard before to get their voices out, to start commenting and sharing a narrative on events as they happen. And we can go in, and I'm sure we may in the next panel start to talk about specific events and how the reaction has been to them, and whether or not the policy in response to these different events has changed in the internet era or the new media era. But first I want to just share these numbers with you before we go into this panel. The Chicago Council on Global Affairs recently did a study on American attitudes on foreign policy issues. Among them were American attitudes towards foreign policy in the Middle East and America's relationship with Israel and the Palestinians, and so on. A strong majority of Americans, 66%, the poll found, and this was a recent poll, prefer that the United States not take either side in the conflict. And of course, as we know, especially when we look at votes in the Senate, the inverse is actually true, where much more than 2/3 of the representatives of the people of the United States clearly side with Israel on issues on a regular basis. So there's a disconnect here between public attitudes and policy, foreign policy in this issue. And also they mention on a specific policy issue, 62% in this poll were found saying Israel should not be building settlements in the West Bank. And we see, again, when it comes to policy, both on the Hill and with policymakers, there is, if you have 62% of Americans behind a particular issue, usually for most issues that's a mandate. And when that issue is in line with international law, it should be even easier for those who would expend political capital to do so without much risk. That, of course, is not the case, and we will be talking about this disconnect and the role that the new media and the internet can play in this session. I want to introduce our two speakers. MJ Rosenberg, seated on the left, I guess that's your right, is a senior foreign policy fellow at Media Matters Action Network, and he has worked on Capitol Hill for various Democratic members of the House and Senate for 15 years. He knows the Hill and the lobby very, very well, and he was also a Clinton political appointee at USAID, and he's been one of the most consistent and prolific bloggers on this issue, and as I found out in recent weeks, very active on Twitter as well. From 1998 to 2009, he was the director of policy at the Israel Policy Forum. Seated next to him is Professor Stephen Walt, who's the Robert and Renee Belfer Professor of International Affairs at Harvard's JFK School of Government, where he served as dean from 2002 to 2006. And he's taught at Princeton and Chicago, where he was a Master of Social Science Collegiate Division and Deputy Dean of Social Sciences. And he's a contributing editor at Foreign Policy Magazine, a co-editor of the Journal of International Security. And MJ and Professor Walt both blog regularly. You can find MJ's work in a number of places, including at Media Matters, often on Huffington Post and elsewhere. And Professor Walt, you can see his blog at walt.foreignpolicy.com. So I'm going to ask MJ to start with some opening remarks, and after that, after opening remarks, we'll continue with our discussion.
It's one of the sad things in my life that I don't get to become friends with a really important Harvard professor till I'm 63 years old, and they can't do me any good. Like, suppose I knew Stephen Walt when I was 17. Of course, he wasn't born, but but gee, it's just, anyway. This is the guy, he wrote, this is the Walt of Walt Mearsheimer, and that is the book that really changed the terrain on this issue. I just, biography was mentioned as a legitimate thing to talk about, and I like talking about myself. I mainly like talking about my grandchildren, but I'll do that some other time. I worked on Capitol Hill for 15 years. To quickly say about Capitol Hill, what I think about Capitol Hill, I'll say it right up front. It's all about money, and it's all about re-election. 99.9% of the members of Congress care about nothing except getting reelected. There are hardly any heroes up there of any kind. Maybe there's a few, but some of your favorite liberal, I'm assuming with this crowd, liberal members of Congress are you think that they're brave, but they're only brave or it won't cost them 10 cents. I mean, it's really amusing almost to watch. They'll say, oh, but so-and-so is like, he's so amazing on the environment, or he's so amazing on marriage equality. So I say, oh, yeah, have you heard what he says about the Palestinians? He's a hater. And it's just, this is what it's like up there. And I have to say, it's not a difference I have with Walt Mearsheimer, as if first name Walt, last name Mearsheimer, is that it is all about corruption and these guys being bought with contributions and all that. I mean, not real corruption, not the kind you go to jail for, but this other kind of corruption, the legal kind of corruption. But that's the way it is on every issue you care about. So when people zero in on the Jewish lobby and say, oh, they own Congress, well, let's say have a line of all the people who own Congress. I mean, it's like every single issue that is important to the American people, there are lobbyists who are up there thwarting the majority of the Americans. And now we have a situation where maybe the majority of Americans want their own interests thwarted. I mean, we're really dealing with a very difficult situation. And I just sometimes say, why do you pick on the Jewish lobby, the Israel lobby? Well, that's what I know about best. But I've come up against the other ones too. And they certainly give AIPAC a run for the money, that's for sure. Unfortunately, the Palestinians essentially, despite the fact that AIPAC likes to say there's an Arab lobby, there really is no Palestinian lobby that exists in Washington. What they like to say is that there's a Saudi lobby and there's an oil lobby. That's all very well, but they don't care about the Palestinians. All right, how did I get into this blogging thing? I was working at Israel Policy Forum, which was a pro-Israel, pro-peace organization. Someone over there said, why don't you write a column every week? And I wrote this thing called IPF Friday, which we started with 50 people, and then it went out more and more. And then this guy, Josh Marshall from Talking Points Memo, said, why don't you blog at Talking Points Memo? And then Huffington Post asked me to blog there. And this was going on for years. And here I am, 63. If I was just a little bit older, I would have sort of like missed this, you know? Like the internet was invented for me. I have a million opinions on things and I write them nonstop and people read them. It's like amazing. So it's just, on the, I gotta think it's like amazing on the Gaza relief ship. I wrote I'm now at Media Matters for America. It is an amazing organization which is in the business of monitoring right-wing propaganda on everything. They have, until I got there, they did not have any, they did nothing on foreign policy. They made this decision to hire me and hire me with my views because they wanted to be involved with this issue. They wanted to be involved with the Palestinian issue. They wanted to be involved with stopping a war with Iran. I mean, and this is a big thing. Matt Duss in the back, who is like my younger counterpart at the Center for American Progress, he's also all over the place. What has changed since their book, maybe, is that big institutions that rely on contributions hire people like us and aren't afraid to hire people like us. And that is an important change. It used to be the AIPAC crowd, as it was said before, owned the terrain. So what's going to, now, now I'm at a place where my stuff goes out everywhere. Matt is, the others obviously are, Stephen is, Mondo Weiss was my Bible. I thought I was the only person who read it. Now it's sort of like everybody reads it. It's like, it's changing. And I think I met Jerome Slater for the first time today. I've been reading him for years. I don't even know who these people are. But the opinions are out there. And it's
You're not alone.
Well, you're in Buffalo. So the blogosphere has changed everything. It was just the New York Times before, and they don't read the New York Times in Oregon, but the young people in Oregon are on the internet all the time. Okay, what is the solution in terms of politics, of policy? Well, there's an organization called J Street, which I'll say there are a few things that have changed everything, sort of. It's like the Walt Mearsheimer book, the creation of J Street, and Peter Beinart's article in the New York Review of Books about how young Jews are becoming disaffected by right-wing Israel. There are other things that changed it, but it's the internet that amplifies all this. When the lobby goes and attacks Peter Beinart, oh my God, the most vicious stuff. If it was just an article in the New York Review 10 years ago, who would read it? Who reads the New York Review before? Just like really swanky New York intellectuals. Doesn't matter. Now it's everybody, because the way the young people read is they don't go to newspapers. They go to the internet. They look for the subjects they care about, and they read about it. So it's this kind of narrowing this way enables people like us who work on this issue to get our stuff read. And it's just changed. It's not just, you're going to get buried in the New York Times. No, it's not at all. I wrote a piece on Marty Peretz, and it's talking about the party that was honoring Marty Peretz. I got that information from Mondo Weiss. They were having this party at Harvard to honor him, and Al Gore was going to be there and all that stuff. I just picked it up, and I went to the original place, and I wrote about it, and I put the list in it. And nothing much happened until that Sunday, when Nicholas Kristof wrote a whole piece on it, and then in his blog said, on his personal blog said, and I got this from M.J. Rosenberg, how would I in the old days, how would Nick Kristof have ever seen anything I did, let alone have the opportunity to take my narrow niche readership and turn it into the New York Times, which causes Harvard to it's amazing. But does it change policy? Not yet. Not yet. Because we're never going to have the money to catch up with the other side on that. But J Street is trying. J Street's raised, J Street ran 2 ads yesterday, full-page ads in the Times and the Wall Street Journal, spent $300,000 on ads. That shows how much money that they've got, and they're spending it on campaigns to elect or re-elect good people who support, progressive policies in the Middle East. But that's not the majority. It's still, whenever AIPAC puts out a letter, actually, when they write a letter and it's circulated by some congressman, hundreds of members of Congress will sign it. That has not changed. The only good news is my friend who works on the Hill said, we used to have only 30 good guys up here. We now have close to 100. And he gave me the list of the 100, and it's true. That's significant. There are 535 members of Congress. 100 of them think about this issue and don't follow the line. So that's important. But the main change will come through demographics. Just the way we talk about how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict will come through demographics. The main change, as Jerome was talking about the Jewish community, it's demographics that are changing the Jewish community. The kids of the people my age. So I'm a baby boomer. We have the most kids, obviously, because we're the baby boomers. We're the most people. are not like the way we were. We were brought up on Israel. Israel can do no wrong. Israel, but the kids, and these are the kids who are on the blogs. These are the best kids at the kids at the elite schools. These are the kids who are going to run for Congress. These are kids to be all over the place. Jewish, not Jewish, whatever. All they don't buy into this stuff anymore. You can't just say to them, "Well, Israel is right because it's right and because of the Holocaust." They don't think just the way Europeans have grown beyond thinking in those national terms. Talk to a German, how proud he is to be a German. They say, "What are you talking about? I'm a European." I mean, the world has changed, and the Jewish community has changed too. What's going to happen with Congress is that once the people who have the money to write the checks is this generation of 24-year-olds, when they're old, I mean, but that's the way life works. These 24-year-olds become the ones who are rich, have businesses, and are politically active. Congress will change too. So we've done. It is inevitable. The fact of the matter is, I talk to kids all the time. 100 people work at Media Matters, and most of them are 24. And the old way of thinking is gone. The APAC kids who show up every year and they drag them to their conference, they say, we have more kids than we ever had before. They all get free trips to come to Washington. That's why they come. The birthright trips that they go to Israel, we had 2 billion kids went to Israel on birthright trips. You can give, if you have a college kid and you offer them a free trip to Libya, they will go because, one, they know they're going to stay in hotels, they're going to be with people of the other sex, and no one's going to be watching them. And it's a foreign country. The fact of the matter is the trending is going in our direction. The politics in this country moves so slow. When the progress happens, you'll notice it first in the House, and then maybe 200 or 300 years later, the Senate will notice. But in any case, I've never been this optimistic, and not about the situation in the region. I'm not saying that. Optimistic about the fact that when we get the information out there, the democratization of information. Charles Krauthammer he matters to the people he drives crazy, who read the Washington Post in paper, and who are mostly older. But he has no impact. The younger ones would say, what is this? They wouldn't even know who he is. They barely care. So it's just like, and I'm going to say to you who are those who use the phrase of a certain age, of which I am, there is absolutely no excuse not to be on the web. You have to. You just have to keep doing it until you get it down, because that is where the important information is coming out right now. It's exactly where I want to be. And if I believed in God, which I do sometimes, I would certainly thank him for having allowed me to have been born in 1947 when television came out, and to be around for all this, and to get to use it, and get to be part of this thing. And the thing is, it's so democratic that there's no reason that any one of you who has an opinion, you can create your own blog easy. There are so many ways to get it out, and that is how we're going to win. If you saw how the difference that tweeting made to the Iranian Green Revolution in a country like that, you know what possibilities we have here. So I'll just end there and just say thank you, and thank you for all your activism.
Needless to say, that is an impossible act to follow. All right, never let yourself be the wind-up act after a born tumbler has been in the audience. I want to start by saying just a little bit in terms of biography, recent biography, and in a sense say that to some degree I'm here because of the internet, not so much the blogosphere, but the internet, and I want to explain why. I sometimes argue that our book, the book I wrote with John Mearsheimer, would not exist without the invention of the internet for two different reasons. As some of you know, we had a lot of trouble getting our original article published after it was originally commissioned by The Atlantic, and then The Atlantic got cold feet. We also tried to get it published as a little book. We talked to some literary agents and we talked to some publishers, and nobody really was all that interested in the idea. And then we eventually, through a long and tortured process, got to the London Review of Books. It was published there. There was another simultaneous footnoted version up on the Kennedy School's website. And 3 months later, there had been 300,000 downloads of the original article. And all of a sudden, literary agents and publishers were calling us. Right, because a market had been demonstrated, that there was real interest for a book on the topic, so we were able to then get a book deal. So it wouldn't exist without the internet. Second, we could not have done the research for the book without the ability to do online searches of all sorts of key sources. If you look at the book, it has multiple citations from the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, Haaretz, the Forward, New York Jewish Week, etc. These are all available online. Many of them are searchable online. When I think back to my graduate student days, when you did research in newspapers on microfiche in the basement of the library, right? The idea that we could have done this book with an army of research assistants and 10 years to do it. The point is, the internet has made an enormous amount of information on this and many other topics readily available, easily found, easily located. So it's no exaggeration to say the book would not exist without the internet. I wouldn't be standing here today if Al Gore had not gone to the trouble of inventing it. Now, then the question is, why do I blog, and why do I blog on this subject, among others? It's not the only topic I write about now. Well, over, I'd say, the past decade, like MJ, I was sort of increasingly impressed by the revolutionary features that the internet was producing, particularly for people in the information business. I first noticed that I was just spending a lot more of my time reading commentary and reading sources in the blogosphere rather than reading newspapers and magazines of opinion. They were just a lot more interesting, and they were often by people who knew a hell of a lot more than an individual reporter who might have at least boned up a little bit. First blog I ever read regularly was Juan Cole's Informed Comment, which emerged as this great one-stop shop if you cared about the war in Iraq, and I'd gotten involved in that debate, so I wanted to find out. I started adding other blogs, and I began to notice that the first 40 minutes of my workday was spent sort of going to the various sites that I had bookmarked, and that's where I was starting to get a lot of information. Moreover, I'm the parent of 2 teenagers, and I was over time increasingly aware of their online habits. They don't get their news from the New York Times or from the network news. They never watch ABC News. They couldn't tell you who any of those people are. They get it from Yahoo. They get it from watching The Daily Show. They do school research on Wikipedia, and their teachers teach them how to do online research intelligently, right, and not be misled by wacky websites of one kind or another. This, by the way, is confirmed by data from survey data, the Pew Internet Survey Project. Only 15% of people over 73 report that they read blogs for news. 26% of baby boomers, 34% of Gen Xers, that's people sort of 32 to 39, 49% of teenagers ages 12 to 17 say they read blogs for news and commentary. So the more I learned about this, the more I decided, along with MJ, this is the wave of the future, and I was going to try to catch it while I still could. I blog because I think it's important for scholars to try and reach broader audiences, not to just write for 3 of their colleagues and their associated graduate students. And blogging is an incredibly effective way of doing that. I blog about Israel, Palestine, and Middle East questions because it's such a central topic for U.S. foreign policy, and I blog about a lot of these issues because I still find it an area where there are lots of taboos, lots of misinformation. I also increasingly, as I've gotten more into the issue, believe that there are just critical issues of ethics and justice involved here. So I blog about that topic, among others. Finally, I think it's clear, and this was where the first panel talked a bit, that the rise of the blogosphere has made it much more difficult for governments to spin a story and to shape perceptions uncritically. Bloggers have become incredibly good as rapid reaction fact checkers. Right? When a speech comes out, when an article appears that is riddled with propaganda, there's literally a horde of bloggers that will immediately go after it, often people with very detailed knowledge. And so if it's an issue you care about, it's easy to start finding the critical commentary and finding it nearly in real time. because there are so many voices who can weigh in on these things. And I think this is terrific. Any major policy statement on this subject by U.S., Israeli, Palestinian officials immediately is under the microscope of all these various people. They're not all going to agree, but if you're paying attention and following the debate, it's easy to start figuring out what's right and what's not. Now, finally, the big question, what impact has any of this had on policy, and especially U.S. Middle East policy? Well, I think it's clear that the amount of attention that blogs get has gone up dramatically. Just to take foreign policy, where I blog, and my situation is rather different than Adam and Phil in that I was fortunate enough to be invited to join a sort of established platform. It's almost a mainstream media e-magazine in some ways. Foreign policy last month got 10 million independent page views. The highest month I've had since I started was 200,000 page views. I think I averaged more in the realm of 75,000 or so independent views per month. A 2007 survey of Congress and congressional staff found that 11% of congresspersons read blogs regularly, but 94% of their communications staff read blogs. 50% of legislative assistants in 2007 reported that they read blogs regularly. They said that they read blogs less than they read other news sources, but they also said 50% said they thought blogs were, quote, more useful than mainstream media for identifying future national problems and debates. So you can see some signs of growing readership and even people in the policy world. And I'd say in the last 2 years I've gotten a dozen or so emails from people inside the government in responding to one thing or another that I've posted, saying, that was really interesting, nice work, or something like that. Now, that said, I think it is almost impossible to find cases where a policy outcome on Israel-Palestine has changed as a result of the blogosphere. Some of you may have examples. I could not think of one. And I think the main reason, and MJ alluded to this, is that most of the mechanisms that drive American policy in the region haven't changed very much. The real causal mechanisms. I mean, first of all, oil is still a major strategic interest of the United States, and some aspects of American Middle East policy are going to revolve around the fact that too many Americans like to drive SUVs, and we continue to be thirsty for that. But second, and I would argue it's actually more important, the political clout of the Israel lobby on Capitol Hill hasn't changed, which is why most congressmen will still roll over when AIPAC comes to call. Again, MJ referred to that. Third, most foreign policy professionals here in Washington and would-be foreign policy professionals are going to stick very close to the conventional wisdom on this topic, because departing from it and doing so publicly could, of course, damage their careers. As the case of Chaz Freeman makes clear, uncritical support for the special relationship or steadfast silence on the issue are still the litmus tests if you want to have a serious foreign policy job in the executive branch. And again, the reason I think there is simple. The basic machinery, especially the role in shaping campaign contributions, hasn't changed very much, despite books that have been written or blogs that have been posted. The discourse has changed, I think, pretty dramatically, but not the individual incentives that congressmen and even executive branch politicians feel on a daily basis. And I think the most obvious illustration of that is the retreat that President Obama made after the Cairo speech, his initial insistence that all settlement building must stop. If you don't believe me, you should go Google Martin Indyke's interview with Haaretz back in July, where he attributes the shift, not me, attributes the shift in U.S. policy after the Cairo speech to anger at Obama over the position he was taking, and in particular links it to campaign contributions. You can read what he had to say about that. Now, all that said, I think the internet in general and bloggers in particular are going to matter more in the future, and I say this for several reasons. First, I think the chances for a genuine two-state solution are rapidly eroding. Some people think we're already past the point of no return, and I say that with regret, because I personally think that's the best outcome. But at some point, it will be clear to almost everyone that two states for two peoples isn't going to happen. And then the conflict will turn into a Palestinian struggle for civil and political rights within this larger call it Greater Israel. That'll be carried out in full view of a watching world, carried live on YouTube, broadcast on Twitter. It'll be on platforms that haven't even been invented yet, disseminated virally, commented on prolifically. And the mainstream media will not be able to ignore that without looking completely foolish. So they will have to cover it too. And this is going to place, if it happens, and it's not certain that it will, George Mitchell may have a rabbit in his hat, after all. But if this does happen, it's going to place American politicians in a very awkward position. Do they support the principle of one person, one vote, independent of ethnicity or religion? That sounds an awful lot like the United States of America. It sounds very consistent with core American values. Or do they support the domination of one group by another as a matter of institutionalized practice? That doesn't sound very much like American values. In fact, it sounds a lot like apartheid, and apartheid has no legitimacy in the modern world. I think bloggers and the internet, if that scenario I've just sketched is what happens, will play a key role in essentially broadcasting that struggle. And again, an American president who faces that choice, which of these two things do you support, is going to be in a very awkward position. Now, if you don't like that choice and you don't think an American president would want to be facing it at some point down the road, then one ought to be going all out for a two-state solution before it's really too late. I was going to stop there, but I was going to say just one more final thing about the blogging aspect. And this is just more on the personal side for those of you who are thinking about starting a blog and are tempted to maybe write about the Middle East and about Israel-Palestine. 2 points. One, blogging is the antithesis of the other kinds of scholarly writing that I do. Scholarly writing is all about striving for perfection. You do multiple drafts. You send things to your colleagues for comments. You don't put anything in print until you've really gone over it many times. I work very hard to try and make sure that what I write on my blog is correct and is accurate, but it's inevitably going to be more provisional. And sometimes you're going to get things wrong. Of course, it will then live out there forever on the internet, and people will jump all over you. And secondly, if you're going to do this, you need a different mental attitude. Scholarly disputes, speaking as an academic, can be pretty nasty, but it's nothing like the blogosphere. And that's true, by the way, even if you don't write about Israel-Palestine topics. Of course, if you do that, you sort of take the normal snarkiness of the internet and multiply it several times. The norms of discourse in the blogosphere tend to be very combative. So my basic advice is if you are hypersensitive to criticism, don't start a blog. But if you're worried about criticism, you're probably not engaged by this particular issue anyway. And that will bring me to my bottom line here. I don't think the blogosphere or bloggers have managed to alter U.S. Middle East policy yet. But if I can paraphrase John Paul Jones, we have not yet begun to write. Thank you.
Thank you again to you both. The first question that I want to start with when we're talking about, I mean, I think it's clear that all of us, including on the first panel, agreed that there is a shift in the discourse, that there is a change, and that the new media has a lot to do with it. Kind of on the macro, more theoretical level, what role should and what role does public opinion play generally, outside of this issue, but generally in foreign policy? And is it different on this issue? Should it be different? I mean, to what extent should we expect that foreign policy should reflect the attitudes of the American public? We saw in the polls that I had mentioned in the introduction that most Americans want to see the United States take an even-handed stance, are opposed to the settlements, and so on. Is it kind of silly to expect that foreign policy reflect public opinion?
Well, my feeling on that is that the perception on Capitol Hill and the executive branch, I think, but even more on Capitol Hill, is that the only group that will vote on the basis of a foreign policy issue is the pro-Israel lobby, is the pro-Israel crowd. Members of Congress think all Jews vote on the basis of Israel. I mean, you'll read articles all the time which will talk about, is Obama going to lose the Jewish vote based on that, as if Right, he got 78% of the Jewish vote, and it wasn't about Israel. It wasn't because they thought he was better on Israel, because they're Democrats, and they're liberals for the most part. But they operate up there as if only Jews care about this issue enough that they'd vote for or against a candidate based on it, and that all the Jews feel the same way. These poll numbers that you would cite, that's 60% or whatever it is who favor settlements, banning settlements, whatever, they don't even pay attention. I would even say that it's so bad up there in terms of their ignorance on this issue that they can get a check from someone who is an environmental activist, but if his name is Eisenberg, it gets chalked up to, this is because of my stand on Israel. I mean, it's so, and really, if you think about it, they never hear. I mean, what they hate most is flack on any issue. They don't like flack. It's not just they don't like people not giving them money. They don't like anyone harassing them on anything.
So members of Congress are not likely to start a blog.
Right. So the path of least resistance is just to please the one constituency that they believe cares intensely about the issue. And that is the Jewish community, which they perceive, and now J Street is helping to change that, but they perceive of being of one mind, which is on the right on Israel.
I'll just amplify that in a more general way. Public opinion obviously does matter. We see it in a number of different respects, but public opinion is pretty malleable. And so it's there for presidents to shape if they want to try and educate the public on a particular issue. We also have a political system that privileges interest groups of all kinds. The vast majority of the American people probably, to the extent that they care about it, understand that our, 50-year-long embargo of Cuba hasn't really worked particularly well. But there is a well-organized Cuban-American community that has cared a lot about this issue, and that's why we've had this kind of bankrupt policy for as long as we've had, and you can multiply examples like that as well. I think the statistics that you referred to suggest that there is more latitude in public opinion. There's more room to shift the policy without jeopardizing public support. But you'd have to do a lot of educating, and you'd have to recognize that there would be some well-organized people who would oppose you on it and would try to make you pay a price.
I just want to continue on that note. As you mentioned that, I started to think about the example that we're currently seeing in Afghanistan, where you have a majority of the American public who's not interested in staying in Afghanistan. And most realist interpretations, and I think yours and others would also say, there's no reason for the United States to be in Afghanistan. It's against the United States' interest to be there. But at the same time, we see the perpetuation of the same policy that we've had, if not, a worsening of it by an increasing of troops there and that sort of thing. So I look at these examples and I wonder, what is it in Washington? What is it, inside the Beltway, whatever it is, that allows people, decision makers, foreign policy decision makers, to so carelessly discount the views of the people who put them in power? I mean, it's about winning re-election, right? I mean, as you said, it's about winning re-election. So is it, are people that willing to change the stance that they have because they see ads and signs because of campaign contributions, or do they really care about the issue?
Well, there is no clear. Politically, it's always dangerous, they think. They've thought this since LBJ. They always think it's dangerous to advocate Nixon called it a bug out. Pulling out. We have to win everywhere, even though, of course, in the end of the day, we don't really win, but we lose. But nonetheless, I think we're even seeing now, more to the point that than even Congress, that we learned from the Woodward book, big surprise, that President Obama made his decisions on Afghanistan based on the same calculation LBJ made. Yeah. That there are limits to how far a Democrat can go on these kinds of things. But I don't see public opinion on Afghanistan is not that clear. Yeah, they're against it. But at the same time, you ask people, well, should we just leave? And that it means lose. and that they say no. I think it's. I don't think it's a case where they're. I think public opinion is amorphous on that issue, and I'm not surprised that Congress has not been much, hasn't been much use on the issue whatsoever.
This is actually a much bigger topic. I think the other issue that goes on here is that the range of opinion in Washington on foreign policy questions generally runs the gamut from A to B. All right. I have the great luxury of having a tenured position at a university, so they can't fire me no matter what I say or what I write. And I came up through a system where what they were interested in was, how good is his scholarship, how influential as it is. I'll be judged on those criteria. People who work in Washington, who aspire to work in the government, who are working at any of the big prominent think tanks around here, have to be very careful that if they ever say something that might be kind of bold or controversial, that's going to show up at their confirmation hearings. That's going to lead people to think they might be a little unsound. They might not be someone who could be trusted with an important foreign policy responsibility because they've said something that was a little bit too outside the box. And this is why you saw all those good Democrats supporting the invasion of Iraq in 2003. In a remarkably candid admission, Les Gelb, the former president of the Council on Foreign Relations, admitted in an article last year that one of the reasons, not the only reason, but one of the reasons that he supported the invasion of Iraq, he said, it was a pathology of the foreign policy community, the need to maintain your credibility by supporting hawkish military actions. Right? And this is remarkable because this is being said by someone who's at the end of his career. And he still felt that in order to be taken seriously, he sort of had to show that he was in favor of policies like this. Well, if you were 35 years old and you're trying to make your way, are you going to take a radical position on any controversial issue? No. You'll try and figure out where the consensus is and maneuver within that. So on Afghanistan, on Israel, Palestine, on any number of other subjects, you are not going to find very many foreign policy wannabes or wonks taking a position that's at odds with whatever they think the sort of prevailing inside the Beltway consensus is. Make it one final point. I think the genius of the neoconservative movement, by the way, was for many years to not care about this particular problem, and in a sense to say we're going to stake out a position that's outside the consensus on any number of subjects, and we'll just keep hammering away at it, and we'll do it loudly, and we'll do it in lots of different places, and over time we won't get them to go all the way over to our agenda, but we can move the debate a long way. Right? And I think over a 25-year period they were very successful in doing that. Fortunately or unfortunately, that then led into the invasion of Iraq, which has partly, but not entirely, discredited that worldview.
This reminds me of, will these kids that I'm investing so much hope in, will they, when they start thinking more about career, if AIPAC is still as powerful and operates the way it does now, and I'll tell you how one of the ways, I worked there for 4 years, back in the 80s. It wasn't as right-wing then, and Oslo hadn't happened then. So my view on in those days was, well, the Palestinians have never agreed to recognize Israel. My views changed when the Palestinians did recognize Israel, which they did in 1988. But in any case, I did work there, so I know how they operate. No one gets a job related to anything related to the Middle East in any administration without being cleared by AIPAC. And I personally experienced it. I remember in 1990, I wasn't working there anymore. I was working on Capitol Hill. And I got a call from AIPAC that wanted to know, this guy Bill Clinton's running for president, and he's got this young aide, and he's a Greek American. And are you friends with George Stephanopoulos? I said, yep, I'm friends with George Stephanopoulos. They said, is he kosher? Well, whether he was or he wasn't, I knew what the reason was. And obviously I said, of course he's kosher. I mean, he's 100% kosher. Couldn't be more kosher than George. But the point is, if I had said, no, in fact, I've had conversations with George and he doesn't like Israel, or he's a pro-Palestinian, I would submit that he would not have become the George Stephanopoulos we hear about today. There are so many people, and I can name people who careers ended because of the perception. I mean, the fact is, you all know Rob Malley. Rob Malley should be in the administration. He's not there because AIPAC blackballed him. Chaz Freeman, it was AIPAC that went after him and made sure that he wouldn't get a job in the administration. This is an absolutely terrible thing. So you say, why are there no interesting, why are there no... Dennis Ross, with nothing but a failed career, trusted only by one side, is the guy sitting in the White House. But Rob Malley is doing other things at an important group, but he won't be in government. I mean, and that is the way it is. And that, I have to say all that optimistic stuff there about that, this is a really terrible thing. It gets to the point where, if one of my kids was interested in this issue, which thank God they're not, and said, Dad, I want to be involved with politics, work on the Hill, do all that stuff that you did and everything like that. Should I sign this Jewish Voice for Peace petition? I would say, no, don't sign it. I mean, in other words, back to 1952, when people had to... The issue that is most like McCarthyism, where they can get you 20 years later for something you said 20 years ago, is this issue.
And both of you have written extensively on the lobby. One thing that's really interesting now about blogging, and I wonder to what extent this has an effect, is the ability of bloggers to really expose the lobby. There was, I think it was about a year and a half ago, and this was not even blog related. Of course, it got picked up on the blogs. But you had an email that was being circulated around Capitol Hill with an attachment to a resolution. You recall what I'm talking about. I'm sure you do too. And the name of the attachment was AIPAC resolution.
Right.
And it was being circulated around from member's office to member's office with no shame that it had clearly come from a lobby. And of course, this got leaked out. So what the role that the blogs play, that the internet plays in creating transparency about these, obviously you know a lot about that and played a big role in opening that door. What potential does that have?
I think this actually has a lot of potential. And first of all, lots of lobbies write legislation and draft letters, dear colleague letters for congressmen. So AIPAC's not the only one who's doing this. It was embarrassing that they got caught, but you could find lots of other lobbying organizations doing exactly the same thing. What's more interesting is the capacity of the blogosphere now to expose the silencing, the marginalizations, the sort of McCarthyite tactics. Jewish Voice for Peace has a great website called Muzzle Watch, which reports on efforts not only in Washington but around the country to silence people, to have lectures canceled, things like that. And they've had a number of important successes in getting people's invitations returned after somebody had gotten cold feet and canceled an invitation to Desmond Tutu in one case at a college in I think Minnesota as well. I think this is very important. You even get people I think now challenging the frequent use of accusations of anti-Semitism as a smearing device. To the extent that some people on the other side now believe that that's not a very effective weapon anymore. Bill Kristol actually wrote a column in the Wall Street Journal a couple of years ago where he said accusing people of anti-Semitism has been overused. We have to come up with a new label for it, a new name for it. I think all of this is good, and over the next decade, I'm guessing, but over the next decade, a lot of the things that used to work aren't going to work. Silencing is not going to work as well. There are too many outlets. Now I think the blogosphere really contributes to that. More people are willing to stand up, are not being intimidated. Hopefully they see people who have done so doing just fine and recognize that it's possible. And so this is going to become a matter of sort of power politics. Who has real clout? It's I think in many cases likely to get pretty nasty. It's going to be hardball, but at least it's not going to be quite as one-sided in the realm of information and discourse. And if we can get a few more people, on Capitol Hill, maybe even occasionally, God forbid, in the executive branch, to just stand up and tell the truth occasionally, this is an issue where things could tip very, very quickly once they go. And I believe the other side recognizes that, which is why they often fight so ferociously.
And this is part of my next question. I'll ask one more question after this, then we'll open it up to everybody. You said it could tip very quickly. Where's critical mass? I know the foreign policy establishment in Washington, D.C. is probably the most resistant to change on these issues, especially when it comes to public opinion, and translating that into policy, as we saw with South Africa. Where is critical mass? What does it take to get there? And what can these new tools really, I know this is a very difficult question to answer, but at what point? And the question that follows that, and you can go ahead and take a swing at this now because it has to do with the current events, how long will it take? And will it be too late, or is it, as many people think, is it already way too late? A number of people talked about the need, because of the obvious influence of the pro-Israel lobby, the need to make change in the Jewish American community. Do we have time to wait for that, given what's going on the ground?
I just want to say that, now you're getting into it puts me into a dark mood when you ask that question instead of my enthusiastic mood. Just because I have a worst case, for me, it's sort of like the tipping point is in the other direction. I have this image in my head, and I know that if it basically happened, it would play out this way. I think that if Obama gave Israel the green light to attack Iran, which I think is 50-50, whether he will or he won't, that we would wake up to the news of this terrible thing happening in Iran and the rioting breaking out everywhere, and at the same time you will see, I don't know, who's the head of the Democratic Congressional Campaign Committee, Chris Van Hollen, leading 25 people down there to support Israel, because all they're thinking about is, he does the campaign committees, Van Hollen and Menendez in the Senate, those two are like the enforcers. Everything is about, we got to raise money for the campaign. I almost see it like it's so easy. You talk about tipping points. Tipping points can tip either way. To me, that's like the worst case thing that can happen, where we go through this whole 2003 thing all over again, and this time it's Iran, and again the Democrats supported Bush. They're certainly going to support Obama if he does it. And people say to me, well, Obama definitely wouldn't have, if Bush wouldn't do it, wouldn't agree to it, which he wouldn't, Obama wouldn't. But the Democratic Party is different than the Republican Party. AIPAC has far more influence among the Democratic Party than in the Republican Party. It can happen. That's my worst case tipping point in that direction. On the other thing, I would say it would be some kind of a colossal Israeli overreach. But after what happened with the ship, I'm not sure there is anything on that side that will not be defended, including by including by our favorite liberals. So I can't imagine. I don't see anything substituting for my vision of it being time and effort and building slowly. Honest to God, I do not think. I think another thing. If Israel annexed the West Bank, throw in Gaza too, but all of it, and annexed it all, and said they're never getting the right to vote, which we were implying, that kind of thing would cause, and it might ultimately cause some kind of.
It's the de facto situation that we have now,
right?
Without annexation.
But I think if they did it, if they actually did it, and they said no, we're not giving them the right to vote. I'm not going to talk about Republicans. Most liberal Democrats, including your favorites, I don't know who they are, but I'll say, just take a shot. If your congressman isn't what's his name, Keith Ellison. If it's not Keith Ellison and a few others, he or she will go down there and say there are all kinds of democracies in the world. Israel's different because it lives in a very different kind of neighborhood. You cannot expect it to have the one man, one vote kind of democracy. That is what you would get from Barbara Boxer and all these other ones who are so liberal on everything else. So I don't see any event creating the tipping point. I see us creating the tipping point incrementally, step by step, through what we do is words, and what it's words and organizing, but it's going to take time. This is not going to happen in any way overnight.
Yeah, just to make a point about the flotilla, as you mentioned, when the first casualties were reported, I got a tweet about it at about 10 o'clock in the evening, and I think that those kind of things are starting to amplify these events. But tipping point, does it exist?
Yeah, I'm going to try to make sure that MJ can go home feeling good. So I'm going to try and spin a slightly more optimistic story. I don't want to paint. I don't want to paint an overly optimistic story, and I do think that if you're expecting a transformation in American Middle East policy in the next year, you're not likely to see that. Sorry, folks. But there are a number of trends that are cutting the other way. I do think that generational change in the most engaged communities, the Arab American community and the Jewish American community, both work actually in a positive direction. That the 1940s Holocaust founding of Israel generation is aging out. They are going to be less influential. There's lots of information already about what younger generations of American Jews feel about this subject, and some of them are still very devoted to Israel in various ways, but they are not, as a generation, as either engaged by the issue or as dogmatic on the issue. Moreover, many of them, and these are many people I count among my friends, also are terribly worried about where this is headed. They are, they see the train wreck that might be in front of us, which is why they're trying to do something about it. Adam, who was on the first panel, is I think a beautiful example of that. Second thing, what's happening on the Arab American side, which has never been as politically engaged, but part of that is a generational issue as well. Arab Americans are more recent arrivals in the United States. It generally takes 2 or 3 generations before immigrant populations get fully assimilated, fully wired into how this country works, no longer keeping their heads down so that they're not viewed as suspect, but rather educated. They are engaged. I have plenty of students now who are sort of 18, 19, 20-year-old Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans of various other kinds. Some of them don't care about this issue either. They're going off to become economists and lawyers and doctors, but others are engaged by it. They are going to be very good talking about the subject. They're going to be great on media. They're fearless because they are fully Americanized. They know no one's going to deport them or anything like that. And moreover, given the Islamophobia that is starting to rear its ugly head here in the United States, they're also getting very concerned and therefore more politically mobilized to prevent that from happening because they see it as both completely inconsistent with American values, but also potentially dangerous for them as well. So you're going to get some shifts over time in the balance of power politically. And because I am a congenital optimist, despite my realist inclinations, I believe that that's more likely to lead to an American policy that would be much better for the United States, but also better for all of the peoples in the region as well.
Well, thank you guys very much. I want to open it up at this point to questions, just by a show of hand, questions that we have. Okay. So please keep them brief so that we could try to accommodate. I know there are many here. Why don't we start right here, and then we'll move from there. And just if you could let us know who you're directing your question to, if it's to somebody.
For both speakers, because I feel very depressed right now. Why would then Obama come out with an idea that he can resolve the question in 1 year? What made him do that? And remember that Hillary Clinton was the first prominent American to accept a Palestinian state during her visit to Gaza and Ramallah and this, when President Clinton was in office. How do you explain that? I mean, are they fooling us or what?
I actually, the most recent push, we're going to get this deal done in a year. I kind of have no idea why they did that, because I thought the prospects for success were so bleak that for the president to commit himself in such a public way was just asking for trouble. And I spent some time trying to ask myself, well, do they have the rabbit in their hat if they got some sort of pre-deal? I believe, although I cannot prove this, that they are going to attempt to take Mahmoud Abbas's arms, break both of them simultaneously, and get him to sign some sort of framework, piece of paper, something like that. We've seen this movie before in a different form. It was called Oslo. All right, and it's not going to ultimately solve the problem, but it would maybe allow Obama to say, well, you see, I told you I'd get serious about this, and I at least got something. Go back to the first year of the administration. What then I didn't understand was why they did not have a plan B. They started off actually quite well. Not perfectly, but quite well. They made it clear they wanted to be serious. They weren't going to wait till year 8 of the last year of the second term. Most of the atmospherics running up to the Cairo speech were very good, and the Cairo speech itself and surrounding diplomacy, I thought, was fine if you were serious and you understood that you had a battle on your hands. Now, and I believe they assumed that all they really needed to do was bark loudly and that Prime Minister Netanyahu would cave. I think they genuinely believed that. There's various arguments for why you might have deluded yourself into thinking this. The point is, I don't believe anybody inside the White House ever asked the question, what are we going to do if he says no? What's our follow-up? And they spent the summer of 2009 suddenly realizing that they had a problem on their hands because they were not getting the cooperation from Netanyahu that they wanted, and they were not getting then the reciprocal cooperation that they wanted to get from Saudi Arabia and others. Right? There was a theory for how this was all supposed to work. And at that point, I believe, again, Obama and his advisors were getting plenty of phone calls about how this was not a good idea. This was going to cause real problems for the Democratic Party. And at that point, they entered into retreat mode, which is where you've gotten ever since.
Well, my only addition is, I like the idea that they must have some. I mean, presidents don't do these kinds of things in congressional election years when their popularity is crashing. They must have something.
There must be a pony in here somewhere.
There has to be a pony in there somewhere. Except I have to think that if there was, they would not continue to be so adamant against Palestinian unity. I mean, even the people inside of Fatah who are, who would accommodate, who would try to find some way to be negotiating on behalf of Hamas too. The United States still stands with Israel as if Hamas doesn't exist, as if Hamas doesn't control Gaza, almost as if what we're proposing now is a 3-state solution. So it's like they really haven't, grabbed onto the fundamental issues. What do we do? What are we going to do about Gaza? No one's even talking about it. So and then going back to it, if they break poor Abu Mazen's arms, well, you can't really break his arms before he signs something anyway. But anyway, if he signs something, what is it? And I mean, I'm really asking, like, what is it, and what does it possibly deliver? And who was he even speaking for now?
And I wanted to push you here with this idea that it's just a cheap political win for Obama. Doesn't that go against the entire idea that so many of us have been talking about, that this is such an important American interest? It just seems so foolish. I mean, you'd think that there has to be something going on, but since we have seen this movie before and it ended in disaster, I mean, how can they go and do it again?
But one never wants to underestimate the ability to repeat past mistakes, particularly when you have the same people running the policy. But more importantly, to be slightly more charitable to the president, right? So here's Barack Obama. He's got a war we're losing in Afghanistan. We've still got 50,000 troops in Iraq. The American economy is, let's just say, not robustly healthy at the moment. He knows he's going to get hammered. He and his party are going to get hammered at the midterms, perhaps more than you would normally expect in a midterm election after a big win, where you always lose some seats, etc. So yes, this is an important issue. Oh, and he's got a bad relationship with China right now. Things are not looking all that great in the U.S.-Chinese relations. So everybody in this room thinks he really ought to be doing something different on Israel-Palestine. This may be item number 7 on his to-do list, and he asks himself, how much do I want to sacrifice to get this one solved? I'd like to, But am I prepared to sacrifice all those other things while I do this one? Maybe not, which means if I can kick this one down the road, I'll do it. And maybe if I'm lucky enough to get a second term, then I'll get serious about it. Right?
But he said 1 year, which goes against that.
I agree. Right. But I'm trying to explain something that I have trouble explaining, obviously.
Let's go to this side of the room in the back. I'm sorry. Oh, we have an online question. Well, let's take that, and then we'll go right in the back over there.
There's two online questions. One is from guest 25 of the chat room. Anonymous.
I know him well.
It's a question to pick up on the point of Islamophobia that you made, Professor Walt. Trying to understand if in your view the causes of anti-Semitism how are they different than the causes of Islamophobia? And then Sena Saeed on Twitter asked a question about the new media campaigns put forward by Israeli institutions, organizations, and supporters, amongst others. Kind of what are those prospects for becoming more effective in telling the Israeli story and in undermining kind of pro-Palestinian or views critical of Israel?
The question of the origins of anti-Semitism and possible comparisons with Islamophobia is a fascinating question that I will not be able to do justice to in a brief answer. I'll just say a couple of things, right? That first of all, I think both phenomenon have their roots in general human willingness to be suspicious of those who are different, right? And certainly the history of anti-Semitism in the Christian West, which is where it was obviously at its most virulent, and not just in the 20th century, folks, going way back in history, had much to do with this sense of these people are different, and that makes us worried. That's point number one. Second, almost all of these things depend upon the creation of wild conspiracy theories. In the case of anti-Semitism, going back to, the Jews murdered Christ, they dominate the banks, they're secret cabals, things like that. Now we're seeing similar stuff in the Islamophobia. Obama is secretly a Muslim. He takes orders from people. There's a vast network of imams who are slowly taking over Western civilization. Very similar. And finally, what in both cases often can make this even more dangerous, more venomous, is economic hardship. These sorts of ideas often emerge in periods where people are out of work, where they think someone is at fault. They want to find someone to blame, and it is very easy then for people to sort of rabble-rouse and gin this sort of thing up. And in both cases, it's loathsome and fundamentally anti-American.
I see the other question about the Israeli government's efforts at manipulating the internet to their advantage. From what we've seen of what the Israeli government can do on the internet, they are totally inept. I mean, that we are the world idiocy. What is it? We con the world, racist, horrible stuff. I mean, it's like they have so little understanding of what's going to, work. I mean, I don't know. I think that one of the things about the internet and the blogosphere is that I think that people's level of detecting crap, people detect it really quickly when something is propaganda. I mean, there's all kinds of YouTube stuff. You'll quickly learn what's fake and what's not. Sometimes you're watching things and say, is this real? I mean, that's sort of one of the things you get used to doing if you watch YouTube videos. Someone sends you something and say, is this a joke? I mean, so I don't think the Israeli government is to be that successful. And the other thing is there are very effective Israelis who are putting out pictures every week of the good Israelis going to demonstrations in solidarity with the Palestinians. People are beginning to learn that there isn't just one Israel. In fact, it's split right down the middle, and that there is a large segment of activists, and by percentage terms, a much larger segment than we have in this country, where everybody seems to have gone to sleep, but who are out there putting, I've watched these organizations like Rabbis for Human Rights, who stand there in front of the bulldozers and fight. Those videos are also up there, and they're getting, and you have places like Mondo Weiss, who make sure that they're widely disseminated. So I don't think what they call these Hasbara explanation videos, always put out by some really handsome or beautiful woman who talks in really perfect English, making them all seem very colonial, actually. I think it's a very strange, foreigners should have accents. When they don't have accents, it sounds like they're colonial. Like, why are you the representative, like the ambassador here? I'm thinking, how confusing is that? He's so obviously an American. But anyway, and which also indicates to me that their so-called Hasbara isn't so brilliant. You want to have somebody represent Israel in the United States, send an Israeli. When it's someone who's obviously from New Jersey, it makes Israel really seem like some kind of an extension of New Jersey? Anyway, no, I'm not worried about what the government's going to do. The internet, it's too hard to get a handle on it.
Too big.
Too big.
Okay, let's take, because we're running out of time now, I want to try to get 3 questions at a time in the back. If you keep your questions brief so we could try to get them in.
Yeah, I don't want this to be depressing, so I'd like it to go to full-blown suicide watch. Because if I told you 18 months ago that Barack Hussein Obama was going to be president, we'd have the flotilla, we'd have the Goldstone report and everything, I think everyone would have said it was the perfect storm and there'd be a paradigm shift. And there just hasn't. And I think the fact that we're having this discussion about, in 2010 about how great the internet could be for us, you've talked very eloquently about the mistakes they've made and they've been exposed, but that's because they're doing so much stuff. I mean, just the Wikipedia edits. And I think it really comes down to this. They see this as existential. And we see it almost sort of as academic and an important policy issue. And I think that's the gulf. That's the gulf in money. That's the gulf in resources and everything. And so I wonder, you talk about tipping points. I mean, clearly we've had them. We've had things that should have made huge differences. And I just want to know what you think would be the perfect storm at this point.
Okay.
Who's
And
next?
there's a all the way in the back over there, and then we'll go to the other side of the room to take one more question.
My question is for Stephen Walt. It has to do with traction, similar to what he was saying, but hopefully a little bit more positive. I'm wondering how new media is going to help us do what the neocons did, and that's pretty much it.
And over here, in the back, in the back, right back there,
My question is for Mr. Rosenberg. You depressed the hell out of me again, like everybody else. But what I need something concrete, because I can't wait for my kids to grow up and everybody else's kids to grow up. And I want to know what we can do now to either grow that 100 in Congress, or do you think that's even too optimistic and we should just support them so they don't backtrack?
Let me just take one thing from that and also put it to you. When I was putting this panel together, I noticed that the blogosphere, particularly people who blog on this issue, like many institutions, is dominated by men. And I was wondering what you think about the lack of female voices in the blogosphere on this issue or other issues that are policy related, and what that can add. So for everyone out there who's wondering why the composition of this panel is the way it is, I want you to know it wasn't easy to find many prominent female bloggers, and I think part of your comment is very well taken, that female voices need to be a part of the blogosphere as much as any other discussion. So we had a number of different questions and comments. Please go ahead.
I won't probably cover everything. I'll just read the perfect storm. What would be the perfect? I don't know. I'm inclined to think, partly based on what MJ said, is that there isn't going to be this one moment where you suddenly see American policy shift because of some event in the region. I think that rather, like with many social movements, you build, and then there is a point that suddenly the political incentives for American politicians do begin to change in various ways. And my analogy, I guess, would be the civil rights movement, which, for 100 years after the Civil War sort of made no progress at all, right? And then from about 1952 to 1965, suddenly began having an enormous impact. And there are various, good reasons for that. I think that's the kind of thing we're hoping to have happen here. On the question of, how could we do what the neocons did? I do think that what the neocons teach you is that a small number of people, if they hammer away at an issue long enough, can start to change minds. In this case, however, they were not trying to push the United States that far from its sort of go anywhere and do anything and interfere in lots of parts of the world. They just wanted to push it a little bit further, and what many of us are suggesting is much more of a reversal of some key aspects of policy. I don't want to do what the neocons really did, which was, of course, to take the United States and drive it into a ditch in foreign policy. So, in that level, I won't try and imitate them. And then finally, I just want to say there are a number of very prominent and terrific female bloggers on this. Helena Cobbin, Just World News. I forget her Layla. What's Layla's last name?
Haddad.
Yeah, Haddad, who does Gaza Mom.
Right.
It's her website. Phyllis Bennis at Institute for Policy Studies. So there are a number of other people. Yeah, Cecily Sarasky, who's terrific at Muzzle Watch. So there's a whole bunch out there. We could have had a better-looking group, or at least a more diverse group if they'd been included too.
I just want to address the issue that cut me to the quick about being, it didn't cut me to the quick, but it made me a little bit sad that I would seem so depressed or depressing. Let me just say, one, I'm a very political person, and if I am depressed right now, I am much more depressed about the overall situation in the United States now and what we've been seeing in the last 6 months, first directed against Latinos, or illegal immigrants, and now directed with virulence. And I don't call it Islamophobia. I call it Islamo-hatred. They are not afraid of Muslims. They hate Muslims. It is insane. And one of the things and one of the things that really pains me is that I honestly think that the Anti-Defamation League, when they came out against the mosque, they took the match and they threw it onto this cult, and they made it so much worse. And this issue hasn't gone away. They have so I gotta say that I am more depressed about that, more depressed about my Muslim colleagues at work, the guy who sits right next to me at work, who, is an American, but who came here from Afghanistan and is such a patriotic American, and all of a sudden has to think, what's it going to be like for Muslims here? And so I think that stuff, and just, I guess, to generalize about it, the sheer ignorance of the American people and the manipulation so that they support these things like having billionaires' tax cuts forever when they themselves don't have a job. This stuff is all depressing, really, really depressing. The racist stuff on Obama. Is it? Oh, yeah, you mean, what? The article by, yeah. Right, this absolute racist, I mean, we are, there. Yeah, in a publication, someone said you usually see in a dentist's office. Yeah. I mean, this kind of, it really, and I have
by the way, the United States has a long tradition of being anti-colonial.
Right. Yes.
In fact, you'll recall that's how the country got founded. So.
I mean, I just want to separate a little bit. Part of my feeling is the Obama's election was one of the happiest days of my life, my children's life, everybody I know. It was, and to think, and we thought just for a bit that this ugly, ugly thing in our history it was over, and then we see it comes back like some kind of raging cancer when you thought you passed the 5 years and you're cured. I mean, and that's what it feels like. It's the ugliest thing that I've ever experienced, I think, in my life. And okay, so I'm not, as far as the Israeli-Palestinian thing, I'm not as pessimistic as I am, because I do think things are changing. I do think there are people like me, and whose jobs don't get threatened for saying these things that I say. I can name so many people, and they're not all tenured at Harvard. I mean, though God knows if he wasn't tenured, he wouldn't be at Harvard. Really, there is much more freedom ever. At my synagogue this week for Yom Kippur, the speaker during the break between the morning services and the evening services was from the Office of Civil Rights of Justice Department talking about hate crimes against Muslims. He got up there and he said, only in America. I'm an evangelical Christian appointed by an African-American president, and I'm here speaking to Jews on the holiest day of the year about the terrible things that are happening to Muslims. So the fact of the matter is, in my own lifetime, 20 years ago, within the Jewish community, the most common thing people would say about Palestinians is they don't exist. They're just Arabs. Nobody says that stuff anymore. That gold in my ear stuff there, all those lines, that's gone. People engage on the issue. And as far as what I know about the other side, and I still have people who tell me what goes on at the AIPAC lobby side, they feel that they're oppressed, that they're on the run, and that these are the worst of times for them. And one of the reasons I think that and this is my last point, is they don't put out material. AIPAC relies entirely on intimidation. It's not like, that Stephen and I and the others have people at AIPAC who respond. They don't bother to respond. And they are incapable. They don't have any arguments on their side. They're relying on an old generation with lots of money to sustain them. But I think it's changing. And if I didn't feel that way, I and my colleagues would not only be blogging all day, but I'm getting up at 1 and 2 and 3 in the morning, all the time, to get up there and write these things and get so many people get the word out. I wouldn't do it if it was hopeless. And the other thing is, I'm not just doing it for Israel and the Palestinians, because my last scary thought is I have grand twins, and they live in the United States, and they're never going to live anywhere but the United States. And the fact of the matter is, if we don't do something about this damn conflict, it's going to blow back and threaten all of us, even here. Thank you.
Well, I think we went well over time, so I think we're gonna stop there. If you all join me again in a round of applause for all of our speakers on the first panel as well.